This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Intimate Alien. It's a new book from David Halpern, a UFO researcher, and my conversation will begin with him when we return. David Halpern is the man before you. This is his second appearance in the Dan Schneider video interview series. He appeared a few years ago on a similar subject. He has a new book called Intimate Alien. And I'll just turn it over to David for the next few minutes. David, can you just give a little background on who you are, your interest in unidentified flying objects in general, and a little specifics about the book?
Okay, back in the 1960s, I was a teenage ufologist, UFO investigator. I grew up to become a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina. And although my official area of expertise was Judaica, the subjects that most attracted my interest were religious traditions of heavenly ascensions and otherworldly journeys, which even at the time I realized were my old ufology in more respectable guises. Over the years, I found myself facing what UFOs meant to me. I no longer believed in them literally, but I could not escape the sense they were a tremendously important subject that had engaged me for many years, and with good reason. And I finally written this book, Intimate Alien, the hidden story of the UFO, to explore what UFOs meant for me, what they mean for millions of others, what they mean for our culture, and I'd go so far as to say what they mean for our species.
Well, let me turn to a figure that I hold on, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. A figure that I think is very important is Jacques Vallée, and you mentioned the book Passport to Magonia, and I've always thought I sort of got into reading about UFOs in the early 1980s. Of course, I saw the ancient astronauts documentaries of the early 70s by von Däniken. I saw the Leonard Nimoy show In Search Of in the mid to late 70s, but I didn't really find it that particularly interesting. However, in the early 80s or mid 80s, I guess, right after I got out of high school, I do remember coming across, of course, you mentioned Whitley Strieber, we'll get to him in a little bit, and a reissue of Passport to Magonia. And I've always thought that Vallée was a very important figure in sort of synthesizing the idea that a lot of UFO mythos was ancient mythos in a new garb. And you seem to be, in a sense, a descendant of that Vallévian, if you want to call it, approach. Is that correct? What is your opinion on Jacques Vallée and his import in UFO studies?
He's one of the two pioneers, it seems to me, that if I were to trace out my pedigree as, I'll say a ufologist, because in a sense I still am a ufologist, that if I were to trace out my pedigree as a ufologist, I would start it with Carl Jung's 1958 book, Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Skies, and take the second, how should I say, the second stop in the path leading to where I am now, with the publication of Vallée's Passport to Magonia 10 years later, or 11 years later, in 1969. That it was Jung who helped us see that whatever else UFOs might be, they were a myth. That is something tremendously important, a collective dream of our culture or of our entire species that came from inside us to tell us valuable things that we might otherwise refuse to be conscious of. And Vallée took this a step further and found the UFOs or UFO-like phenomena appearing in all sorts of traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And those are really the two people who set the track that I followed.
Yeah, you in the book mentioned some of the what we call pre-Ken Arnold uh, thoughts of or cases where people think that they might retroactively have been UFO sightings, the Our Lady of Fatima incident, and some things going back centuries. Of course, there was the 1897 airship scare, which I don't think, if I recall, you mentioned in the book, but. Um, you then get into really the 1950s, and I don't know if you talk about the Men in Black and the Shaver mystery, uh, um, and this was known then as the quote unquote contactee era, which was before abductions. Let me talk a little bit about that. This was a time of great paranoia, the 1950s, the height of the Cold War. How does that fit into the whole UFO mythos as it evolved over the next 50 or 60 years after the 50s?
Yeah, well, I think that what triggered the Men in Black myth, which I would take as an important subdivision of the whole UFO mythology, was, I think, an actual historical visit paid to Albert Bender, who was the head of one of the very early flying saucer groups, by three men who basically shut down his operation. I think that those three men did exist. They really did pay him a visit. And whatever they may have told him, their motives had nothing to do with UFOs. That this was 1953. Senator Joseph McCarthy was at the height of his power and influence. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was almost single-mindedly devoted to rooting out those masters of deceit, the communists. And since the Robertson panel report of January 1953, there was a suspicion that UFO groups, flying saucer groups, could be manipulated by the communists to serve their interest. So the FBI got a hold of a business card of Bender's group, which said International Flying Saucer Bureau, which it was. It was an international organization. And the word international set off all sorts of alarm bells. So they came to visit Bender and made sure, possibly by telling him some terrifying story about UFOs, that he shut down his organization. Now, this, in a sense, was the beginning of the Men in Black that came to movie screens more than 40 years later. But there were two other factors that we have to take into account. One is that it wasn't Bender alone who created the myth of the Men in Black, but Bender with Gray Barker, who described Bender's encounter in his book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, and also that there is a tradition of Men in Black, I think primarily seen as representations of death, who visit people very much to their displeasure and peril. So that I think we have here, and this is sort of a standard feature of UFOs, that we've got a myth created at a very closely definable point in modern history that also has roots that go back through history and sometimes into prehistory. And I want to emphasize here, because people who are watching this may get the wrong impression that when I speak of myth, I speak of it in the Jungian sense of something that's tremendously important and powerful and true, and not as people tend to use it as a word for bunk or nonsense. That is not what I mean at all.
I wanted to pick up on the idea of the contactees, though, because when you look at, I remember looking at the books from the 1950s, paperbacks from the 50s and 60s when this was back in the 80s, and the contactees were people who told tales of flying to Venus with blonde Scandinavian types. And oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and I noticed that you tend to have, you don't really write or speak so much of them or some of like Gort-like robot aliens. In an email I had mentioned that you didn't even bother with von Daniken, and it seems to me. So, do you take more? Do you put more credence in, say, the UFO abductee type thing? Because you talk about the Hills, Betty and Barney Hill. You talk about Antonio Villas-Boas, the Brazilian guy. But some of these contactees who were quite famous in the 50s and went on late night television with their tales, you seem much more dismissive of them. Do you think that they were just sort of carnival barkers like a von Daniken, that you and Villas-Boas and the Hills were not?
I don't know. My first answer to your question is yes, I do think they were frauds and charlatans. I'm not so sure about von Daniken, but I think that the contactees, like George Adamski, were.
Yeah.
My second thought is that I may be selling them short. And there may be something important going on with the contactees that I have not recognized and that I do not deal with in my book. Okay? What I am certain of is that the abductees were absolutely sincere people who have had some sort of extraordinary experience, not being taken aboard extraterrestrial spaceships, but something that demands our attention.
Now, go ahead.
Now, in connection with the contactees, there is one thing that I want to mention, and it came out from what you were saying, that they fly off to Venus with Venusians, Martians, Saturnians, who are in essence human beings, and specifically Caucasian human beings, right? Yeah. Okay, now this is something else that I didn't get into in my book, which is that the other side of the contactee peopling of the solar system with Caucasian humans appears in the African American UFO tradition, as represented in the Nation of Islam, where Mars is populated by very sophisticated black intellectuals. So that I think there's something going on there that needs to be examined. And I think when we get to the bottom of it, why there should be that, let's say, racial splitting, the eagerness to populate the solar system with humans who look like you, that we may find that there was more to the contactees than I'm willing to give them credit for.
how about a later contactee like someone like Edward Billy Meyer? Because in the book, in your book Intimate Alien, you seem to find a lot more credibility in Whitley Strieber, who himself was, a well-known horror writer. But someone like Meyer, who is, I guess, a guy who lived in the Alps and had a series of photographs in the 70s and 80s that he published. I don't think you even mentioned him, but I just remember from reading both of their books, I found them to be very similar. They were both seemed to be very slippery in their explanations of things. They both seemed to say whatever the audience they were speaking to at whatever time wanted them to hear. But again, it seems that someone like Meyer, who claimed to have consensual contact, if you will, versus someone like Strieber, who claimed to have been abducted, you again seem to lean more to the abduction side.
Yeah, and I mean, I would not accept your characterization of Strieber as slippery. I mean, my impression of him, both from his writings and from meeting him, is of a deeply honest and self-aware man who has encountered something that he doesn't understand. Which by the way, he never said that this was UFO aliens. I don't think he ever speaks of having even seen a UFO. But that there's something that he calls the visitors, from whom he experienced some remarkable intrusions into his life. And when his book was published with a painting that was done under his direction of what those visitors looked like, tens of thousands of people saw that and had the response, yes, I've had the same experience. It happened to me also. Mm-hmm. And that to me is extraordinary. I don't know if there's anything comparable.
Well, let's go back about 30 years, though, because you mentioned Richard Shaver. Can you briefly just tell people what the quote-unquote Shaver mystery was? Because if we're talking about, fictionists, I mean, this was basically pulp magazine stuff writ large.
Well, it was pulp magazine that appeared in a pulp magazine. Amazing stories. Yeah, I can tell people what it was. What is the more intriguing question is why it's called the mystery.
Uh-huh. Okay, go ahead.
That in, I think it was at the end of 1943, that Raymond Palmer, an editor at Amazing Stories magazine, received a letter claiming to provide a key to human language. That our letters, the letters of the English alphabet, are sounds. Each of them has a meaning that we are not aware of, but if we become aware of it, once we take it into account,
go ahead.
We can understand how our language works much better than without it. And this seems to be a fairly, what would you say, not exactly the most thrilling revelation, and yet it provoked an enormous response from readers of Amazing Stories. That Palmer invoked the scene from Miracle on 34th Street, where bags of mail are carried in to the courtroom, and he had that same sense that bags of fan mail claiming to support the letter that he published, which was signed for some reason S. Shaver, that bags and bags of letters came pouring in support of it. Gradually, it emerged that the linguistic part of Shaver's claims was only a part of them, that they involved revelations of how the Earth had been settled by colonists from outer space. We are their descendants. Also among their descendants are beings called Diro, who are degenerate creatures who live in the caves under the earth, who have inherited the marvelous machinery of the elder races and who use it for their own perverted sexual and sadistic pleasures. Shaver wrote a series, presumably with Palmer's help, although it's hard to disentangle the two, a series of stories on this theme, which appeared in Amazing Stories, which boosted its circulation fantastically, and which came from the beginning to be called the Shaver Mystery. Now, why a mystery? And I think you have to understand that for Palmer, a mystery was not a riddle to be solved, but almost a metaphysical state in which brings the salvation of mind and soul. And Shaver's stories to Palmer opened those possibilities for all of us.
David, I want to now focus on point of views, and it's a thing that I'm going to invoke now and bring up a little bit later in the interview. You give two good examples of what I would consider point of view arguments. The first one is on page 38, where you talk about a young unmarried couple who describe a UFO along with her parents, and they were not married, and how all but the young man saw, I guess, a typical UFO, and the young man had a very sexualized vision of the UFO. Can you describe or just go through that incident and why you wrote about it for quite a bit in the book?
Yeah, because here that it took place in January of 1974 in Philadelphia. It was on a bitter cold night, and Matt Graber, the late Matt Graber, a ufologist in Philadelphia, got a call reporting a UFO. He went out, was supposedly being observed by four people. The person who had phoned him, his young wife, and his wife's parents. Graber went out and tried to find these people, could not find them, did not see a UFO. And at first he thought he was being pranked, but they kept phoning him. And the next day, the four of them met with him, and they looked over. They tried to describe what they'd seen, and he asked them to draw pictures of it. Three of them drew, as you said, a conventional disc with a dome over it. But the fourth drew what, to me, looks clearly like a detumescing penis sheathed by a condom, which has ruptured precisely where it needs to stay intact. And this seems to me quite related to a detail that comes out only at a late stage in Graber's account of the episode, that the young man and his pregnant young wife weren't exactly married. Now, think back. I don't know if you're quite old enough to remember the mid-70s, but I certainly am.
Yeah.
That it was coming to be taken for granted that people unmarried people would sleep together, live together, but it wasn't an option nowadays for unmarried people to have children. That if the lady got pregnant, there were big decisions to be made under pressure. And it's very hard for me to think other than that the young man projected this very painful situation in which he'd been plunged into the sky. Now, in his drawing, he has a green light on one side of the object, a red light on the other side. And as one of the readers of my Facebook fan page pointed out, this is FAA regulations for aircraft. And my reader remarked, I don't think UFOs have to follow FAA regulations. So I would assume that what these people were looking at was an airplane, and yet distorted beyond recognition by three of them into conventional flying saucers, and by a fourth into the representation of the dilemma in which he and his girlfriend had found themselves, which to me seemed to be an excellent example of how, yeah, the stimulus for a UFO sighting is in the sky.
Mm.
But what we see with our minds comes from inside us.
Yeah. I mentioned the Antonio Villas Boas case, and he was a Brazilian farmer who claimed to have sex with a very aggressive female alien who was quite human. He went on to live a very normal life, apparently, died, I guess, 20-some years ago. But then you also talk about the most famous abduction case, the first one, that was given serious treatment, if you will, in the late 60s, the Betty and Barney Hill abduction of the early 60s. And what I found interesting is I have read a number of books, a number of articles. I think I even interviewed a fellow, or I've spoken with a fellow who actually did a detailed deconstruction. You mentioned the Outer Limits episode that aired a few days before that abduction. And what I found really interesting, especially given how you spoke of African Americans, that Barney Hill was black, Betty Hill was white, and most people have focused on the fact that Betty Hill's story seemed to be more detailed. Most accounts in different books, she had the famous star map that she drew that Carl Sagan then later debunked, and that Barney's account always seemed to be mirroring hers, but in far less detail. Yet you spend much more time talking about Barney's account. Why was that? Or is that?
Because Barney is the one who showed the most powerful emotional response to it.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that he was the first one whom Benjamin Simon hypnotized. And for those of your viewers who are not familiar with the case, I would have to say that Simon was a very highly respected expert on the therapeutic use of hypnosis, who had no interest whatsoever in UFOs, but whom the Hills came to consult because of certain worrisome physical problems that were afflicting Barney that would not clear up. And Barney was the first of the two for Simon to interview. Now, Simon later remembered that Barney became so agitated as the memories returned to him of what he had experienced that Simon was afraid he was going to throw himself out the window. Philip Klaus, the late Philip Klaus, who was for a time the leading UFO debunker in this country, had to admit it. He listened to the tapes and he said, I could agree totally with the doctor that Barney had indeed seen something and it had been a terrifying experience. Now, I think Klaus underrates the intensity of Betty's emotional reaction to the recovery of her memories. But I think he is right about this, that it was far less intense than Barney. And that's why I chose to focus on Barney.
Uh-huh. So for you, in doing this book, because there was far more intensity, this gets back to seeming to me, the overall, you as a person who studied religion, that it's the spiritual or the emotional aspect that is the most important rather than the quote unquote nuts and bolts approach.
Yeah, because there was no nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
There was no nuts and bolts. They weren't taken aboard a flying saucer. One James McDonald, not to be confused with a scientist who has been very, in the 1970s was quite pro UFO, that this James McDonald followed the same path that Betty and Barney drove the night they had their abduction, and he saw the light that was following them.
Yeah.
It turned out to be a light on a lookout tower on one of the mountains they were driving through, and that its seeming motion was in fact the motion of their car. So, as in Philadelphia, the stimulus was quite mundane. What counted was what burst out of them in response to the stimulus. Here was an interracial couple in 1961. Both Betty had a history of being deeply concerned with racial justice. Both she and Barney were very active in the civil rights movement at a time when the civil rights movement was not particularly respectable, and a lot of people thought of Martin Luther King as an agitator. That these were both people who were invested in the wrongs that this country had done to its blacks, and who wanted very much to try to right these wrongs. Now here they undergo an experience which in detail after detail suggests the experience of enslaved Africans being abducted in the middle of the night and taken off into an alien ship. And I do not exaggerate when I speak of the slave ship as an alien ship. That was precisely how it was perceived. We know that from contemporary 18th century sources. So to me, the clear conclusion is yes, Barney Hill had an intense experience. It wasn't what he thought it was. Okay, and even on the surface, if you read, this is often not mentioned in accounts of it. What does he see when he's looking at the flying disc? He sees a red-haired Irishman aboard. Now, come on, you're not going to find red-haired Irishmen aboard intergalactic spaceships. But Barney explains why that's important. Irish people, he says, normally don't like blacks. But some of them are friendly, and when I see a friendly Irish person, I need to go out of my way to be friendly back. That's what Barney spends an enormous amount of his time thinking about. How do you negotiate a situation where you can expect a lot of hatred around you, and yet you will find friendliness, and you have to acknowledge it. Okay? And he says, this Irish person is friendly, but then he's gone, and there's a Nazi. There's a German Nazi wearing a black leather jacket. Okay? That makes no sense if it's an interplanetary spaceship.
But it's dream logic.
Sorry?
It's dream logic.
Yeah, yeah. And if I were a UFO debunker, which I'm not, I'm a skeptic, but not a debunker. If I were a debunker, I'd say, okay, it's a dream, forget about it.
Yeah.
But being a skeptic and being shaped by Jung, I would say it's a dream, therefore, attention must be paid. And I set forth in my book what, in my sober moments, I regard as a very wild hypothesis, but I think it's true. And that is that Barney was retrieving memories of what his ancestors had undergone and that was responsible for their having come to this country.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that the Boas case, the alien he claims to have sex with also had red hair, but pubic hair. You mentioned that.
Yeah. And as proof that there was something very unnerving about that, when when I was a kid, when I was a teenage ufologist, we didn't even hear about the Livius Boas.
Yeah.
Because ufology was too buttoned down for a story like that. But the first full account of it was provided by Jim and Carl Lorenzen, two very prominent ufologists in the 1950s and early 60s. And when they reported it, Carl Lorenzen arbitrarily shifted the blood red pubic hair into the spacewoman's armpits. That apparently there was something about an alien whose crotch was bloodied. So yes, apparently we all know what that apparently is.
Yeah.
That's very disturbing.
I want to spend the next few minutes talking about some of the other stuff in the book, and then for the rest of the interview, I want to sort of freeform with you because I want to bring up a few things in the UFO mythos and the idea of myth itself in the very Jungian sense to sort of end the show. But I do want to talk about sort of the granddaddy, well, if not the granddaddy, the fundamental founding myth of modern ufology. Yes, Kenneth Arnold saw the first disc skipping through the sky, but we're talking Roswell here, and Roswell has become, a multi-billion-dollar cottage industry. My wife and I, a decade ago, were in Roswell. I saw the Roswell Museum and stuff. Then it was in an old abandoned or an old theater that was converted. I think it moved to a new building a few years later. But what is your take generally about the quote-unquote Roswell incident? Actually, it was near Corona or some other city, but if you can, expound.
Oh, yeah, and it's a myth. It's a myth. I mean, the most important thing people need to realize that we lose sight of entirely now is that Roswell got a brief burst of publicity in the second week of July 1947, and then completely fell into obscurity. That for 30 years, no one had ever heard about Roswell. Jerry Clark, whose UFO encyclopedia is probably the most exhaustive resource for knowledge about the UFO phenomenon, he could only find one or two references to it between 1947 and 1978. In 1978, Roswell was rediscovered with a new twist that it didn't have originally. Originally, when Roswell became news, it was just about a landed, not crashed, landed flying saucer, which was then debunked as a weather balloon.
Yeah.
No reference to bodies being found inside it or in connection with it. In 1978, people who spoke to the late Stanton Friedman had memories of bodies being found in connection with the crash disk. And it's in that form that Roswell conquered the world.
And wasn't it the paperback book by Charles Berlitz that took that whole reforged myth into the public consciousness?
Yeah, I think it was. It was nominally Berlitz was a co-author of it, but it was really written by William Moore.
Okay.
The book came out in 1980. That reintroduced it into the public consciousness. Kevin Randall, did a lot of extremely important investigative work that he published in a couple of paperbacks that gave Roswell even wider circulation. Through the 80s, Roswell, let's say the myth and its power grew. It did not reach its glory days until the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
That's when the Roswell Museum was founded. That's when the most gripping version of the Roswell story, the memories of Glenn Dennis, became known. Dennis claimed, at least, that he never told his story before about 1990. And one of the things I've tried to discover is the extent to which we can find earlier attestations of it. Do we have time to actually talk about that story?
Go ahead.
Yeah. That Glenn Dennis, at the time when the Roswell crash supposedly happened in 1947, was working in the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, and like pretty much every other business in Roswell, it was dependent on the Roswell Army Air Force Base right to the south of town that provided services for them. Well, one afternoon, and this is what Dennis remembered, one afternoon he got a telephone call from the base. And the caller wanted to know, what are the smallest coffins, hermetically sealed coffins, that your funeral home can provide? And Dennis says, so why? What was there been an act? Oh, no, nothing. We just curious, just want to know in case something should happen for the future. But how soon can we have them? And Dennis said, well, you could have them tomorrow, really. And then an hour later, he got another phone call. How long would it take bodies to decompose in the desert so as to alter their chemical makeup? And he says, was there an accident? Oh, no accident. No, nothing happened. But then he had to go to the base to see, I think that a soldier had gotten into a small accident that Dennis gave him first aid, drove him to the base, and he saw, as he parked, a van with what looked like coffins with what looked to him like Egyptian hieroglyphics written on them. And he went inside one of the buildings. He was looking for a friend of his who was a nurse. And she saw him. She said, oh, my God, get out of here. You're going to get in trouble. Don't stay. And he started leaving. He was escorted out by a couple of MPs. But as they were going, he heard a voice saying, bring that son of a bitch back. We're not finished with him yet. And there was a red-haired officer accompanied by a black sergeant who started making threats. And Dennis said, look, I'm a civilian. You can't do anything to me. And the officer said, we sure can. They'll be picking your bones out of the sand. And the black sergeant said, he would make good dog food for our dogs. Now, I mean, and later, I think it was later, he met the nurse for a Coke, and she told him about that there were these corpses, half devoured, that they were autopsying them. The stink was so horrible that they had to move them into an airplane hangar. It was the worst thing she'd ever smelled. And later on, she disappeared. Supposedly, she was on a plane that had crashed. Dennis gave one of the ufologists her name, and it was Self, Naomi Self, S-E-L-F, which I would take to mean that she was Dennis's self.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now this to me is one of the most gripping mythological tales in world history. even though the real action takes place off stage. The dentist doesn't really see anything. He hears about it, but hearing about it, it has more power. Now, I guess you want to know, where does all this come from? And I think it was well explained by an Air Force captain named James McAndrew, who wrote a report on Roswell in 1997 that, in my opinion, has been quite unjustly neglected. That he thinks that this goes back to a horrible airplane accident in 1956, in which a plane spun out of control. Its crew members were burned alive, their bodies horribly disfigured, and they were prepared for burial at the Roswell Funeral Home, where Glenn Dennis worked. And what McAndrew suggests is that this utterly traumatic experience he projected onto extraterrestrials and displaced back from 1956 into 1947. And I think that's where it comes from. But I think it also has resonances because it's an emblem of death. And I think death is most fundamentally what UFOs are about.
So, David, I want to turn now from what's in your book to get a bit more metaphysical, a bit more Jungian with you. And for people who want to know about the book, they can go to davidhalpern.net. I'll link to that website. I'll link to your Amazon page. You can get it from Stanford Books. And what was the other source you had mentioned before we started?
Well, there's a wonderful local bookstore in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, called Flyleaf Books.
Okay. So those are the places you can get it. As I said, I'll link below. But I want to turn a bit more speculative and a bit more internally to the human psyche here and have you sort of freeform with me. You'd mentioned Carl Jung, and we'd mentioned Jacques Vallée, and I want to go off in that territory because I think that's the most fertile ground where we can talk about this. And I just wanted to ask you, have you ever heard of the term negative capability? It was coined by John Keats, the poet.
No, I haven't.
Well, negative capability is basically the ability to take two seemingly disjunct or two seemingly unrelated topics and make a connection between them that is only later the mind goes, aha, that makes sense, even though beforehand you might not have gotten that. And this is something in creativity that I think is very real. And I want to relate this to the UFO phenomenon, or even paranormal phenomenon too, in general. And I want to start off with talking about. There was a myth that I remember reading in the 1980s. I got a book, a paperback book. Maybe it was from the library. You know, it was sort of like Jerome Clark's UFO encyclopedia, but it was an encyclopedia that listed paranormal incidents. And one of the more famous ones was the quote-unquote David Gray case about a guy in Indiana who walked out into a snowy field one day and just disappeared. Well, there was never David Gray. It was never in Indiana. And it was just an archetypal thing. And then there was this repeated story of what was called green children, the green children of Woolpit.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to just get into that because here's why. I'm creative. When I was 6 years old, I drowned in a lake in New Hampshire called Forest Lake. It's up near Littleton along the Ammonoosuc River. And when I was drowning, I remember thinking I was outside my body and seeing my body floating in the water above me. And then I was suddenly pulled to the surface by kids that were greenish in hue. They took me to a cave. I had, the details are not particularly important. But the thing that's important is, at that time in 1971, I had no idea about the quote-unquote children of Woolpit myth, or sometimes it was set in Wales or Spain or France. Now, here's the thing. Did I really have that memory in 1971 at the age of 6, or did I backwards form that memory a dozen, 14, 15 years later, when I read the Wool Pit Myth and maybe had a dream that I thought was a memory from 14 or 15 years earlier. And when I think about that, I think about that's an interesting thing, but I'm a creative guy. And when I think about UFO stories, there seems to be this very similar thing, especially the abduction stories. There's a light, something happens. The guys with the big gray eyes, like from the Communion cover, they're looking down and operating on you. But a creative person is not going to have that very rank and file, off the shelf kind of story. So I'm wondering, when you look at stories like the story about the young man who differed from the three other people in describing the UFOs, I think that actually the more interesting cases are when there are different points of view, because many tests have shown that if a professor is giving a lecture and someone runs in and steals his briefcase, people say, "Oh, he was a tall guy with brown hair." No, he was a short guy. He was kind of portly. People have different point of views. So, what is your take on point of views and human fallibility when it comes to these kinds of mythos?
Okay, I think the first thing you have to focus on is that I am not trying to argue for any objective reality to these objects. As a matter of fact, I almost take for granted that there is none. That whatever stimulus there is quite banal, or quite mundane, I should say. So I have no problem with the idea that there's distortion. What fascinates me is the process by which this happens. And your story, by the way, just blew my mind, and we need to go back to it. Because this, I think, is fantastically important. And I'll tell, as we go on, it may become clear why. But I think back to a fascinating article by Kevin Randall that was published in the International UFO Reporter about a pair of college students, I think in Iowa, who saw UFO land. Now, the UFO, as Randall was able to determine, was actually an airplane that they had seen coming in for a landing, I suppose from an unusual angle or something that disoriented them. You know, we all know how very easy it is to become disoriented. But what Randall documented there is that the young man, although he didn't know what he'd seen, continued to describe it more or less accurately. The young lady, within 48 hours, had turned it into a domed disc in which she actually saw some sort of humanoid beings piloting it. Again, if I were a debunker, I would just say, okay, we can throw that out. But I'm not a debunker, so I'm going to say, we need to examine that. And I don't have the equipment to do that. You know, because I would need to know, among other things, what was the relationship between the two of them. They were apparently dating. How involved were they? And this is the sort of questions I asked about the young man and his pregnant young wife, who wasn't his wife, and how that affected the different perceptions. What was there that would have made this young woman so radically change her memories in the space of about 48 hours? And Kevin was quite clear that there was no insincerity at all, that she genuinely believed in what she'd seen. So I think this is a tremendously important question, which broaches on the very baffling question of when people jointly observe things that can't have been there. I mean, the most obvious, outstanding case of that is the miracle of the sun.
Yeah.
At Fatima in October of 1917, in which a crowd estimated by some people as 70,000 all saw the sun fall to Earth, which you and I know that it can't possibly do.
Yeah.
So how did 70,000 people see it at the same time? And I don't know. I mean, I think this is the question that ufology now, a real ufology, ought to be about.
Yeah.
Okay, now, go back to there's one story I read relatively recently uh, that broaches on your story,
Hmm.
and that is, do you know the story of Valentich? I can't remember his first name. That he disappeared, was late 70s, early 80s, something like that. That he was flying his plane a fairly short distance, and then disappeared. No one has ever
Oh, this is like
figured
the
out.
Bermuda Triangle stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but this is, I mean, the story, it
yeah,
really seems to have happened.
yeah,
Now, I mean, I would assume that it was some ordinary accident that we
yeah.
can't, that's impossible now to reconstruct. But what I found interesting was the report by someone. What was his name? I can't remember his name. That he spoke with a woman who had seen an apparition in her room, who came to visit her, of a young man, and the investigator showed her a photo of Valentich, and she said, "That is the man."
Hmm.
Now, I would assume that somehow or another she back projected what she'd seen, or what she back projected the photo onto her memory of what she'd seen.
Yeah,
And that gets us a little bit closer to your experience.
yeah.
But now, why I found your experience so exciting is, I don't know. I did a blog post. I did a blog post on the Green Children of Woolpit,
Yeah.
and my reason for doing that is I was trying to answer one of the most intriguing questions in the mythological study of UFOs, which is, where do the little green men come from?
Yeah.
Nobody. Okay, I may exaggerate. There may be one or two, but almost no one reports when they see the UFO occupants. Almost no one remembers them as being green. So why does that become an indestructible trope
Yeah.
if no one ever experiences it? And I tried to look for antecedents in mythology and popular culture.
Yeah.
I did not let the Jolly Green Giant go unnoticed, because the Jolly Green Giant was originally a little green man. It
Yeah.
was the produce, the beans or whatever, that were giant. And one of the background stories is those green children who appeared at Woolpit,
Yeah.
and who claimed to have come through a tunnel.
Yeah.
And now, if you spontaneously, in a near-death experience, were rescued by green children, then I would say this Jung is triumphant.
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with an archetype spontaneously appearing. But even if you did back project from reading about the green children of Woolpit, why should you have done that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me, because I've got a thesis, and that's why I've got you. So I want to pick your brain. So you mentioned it was a near-death experience, and many years ago, I was involved with a woman who claimed to have had a near-death experience herself, but it was the typical heading towards the light, meeting angels
Yeah,
kind of experience
yeah,
versus my green children one. Now, the difference was this woman was not creative. I'm creative, and so I my thinking is that a lot of what passes for uh, Bigfoot sightings, UFO sightings, Virgin Mary sightings, chupacabras, etc., is the frustrated creativity of ordinary people. But their frustrated creativity, because it is not real creativity that a Strieber or I can conjure up, they have a herd mentality. So it's always bug-eyed aliens who are looking over them. It's always angels. It's always some drunk pisses on a wall and we see the face of Christ. It's always these very tropes that come to the fore. And I want to give you another example. I grew up in a very Goodfellas environment. A lot of machismo, a lot of violence, a lot of gangsters, and I saw people killed. The very first time I saw someone killed was outside a knitting mill that was owned by my landlord, my parents, where we lived in an apartment. And I was hiding in an alleyway with a cat. And by the way, the green children that I had actually had feline-like features, which is interesting. But so I was holding this cat, and I remember hiding under a rose bush and seeing what I thought were the killers. But they were these guys wearing fedoras with red eyes, like LED lights. A few years later, when I was about 10, this was 6 years old when I saw the first murder, and it was a real murder. But I had what I call a dream of waking up in the middle of the night, feeling opening my eyes and seeing these what I called hoods, HOODS, a hood, like a gangster hood. But these were guys wearing fedoras with blackened faces I couldn't see, with those LED eyes standing over me, and I felt like a poke into my chest, and I couldn't breathe. And I was on the second floor of the house I lived in. Now, this is very similar to an abduction experience, but it's tinged by growing up in a Goodfellas type environment with these hood-like creatures with these black eyes and wearing these fedoras. Now, this is the mid-70s. So here's another example of what someone might say was a supernatural experience, but I say it's clearly me taking what to an ordinary person might have been a UFO abduction dream or a Strieber-like visitor dream, but because I grew up where I grew up with people like the Jimmy Hoffas and the John Gotti types, I crafted it into something very much from my own experience. And I think, again, people who are not really creative like that are going to just go with the very archetypal, oh, they're just bug-eyed aliens. What is your take on that? That we all craft things, but some of us, because we have more creativity, don't flow into the herd mentality of angels in the light or, UFO aliens with the wraparound black eyes.
I mean, your suggestion is plausible. I don't know that I would necessarily use creativity as the variable.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, what you, I take it. I mean, have you ever read Albert Bender's Flying Saucers and the Three Men?
Years ago, yeah.
Because what he describes is exactly what you described. Mm-hmm. Men dressed in dark clothing with fedoras and glowing eyes.
Right.
So then I would ask, have you projected from Bender into your memories? Or are we dealing with independent surfacing of archetypal materials that are in some way shaped by your creative processes? Yeah. And if so, how does that work?
Well, and here I want to tie it into to something, because I'm going to get back to someone that you mentioned in your book. And when I emailed you, I talked about Bud Hopkins. And I'm someone who is not a fan of Bud Hopkins. One of the reasons I bring up these two incidents, amongst a few others that I had, was because I read the book Missing Time. And then, Intruders was his second book. In the mid 80s when it came out. Now, Hopkins was a painter, a fairly well-known painter, not a great painter, but a good solid painter. He was not trained in hypnosis. You mentioned the hypnotist fellow before, but Hopkins was not trained in hypnosis, and I think he did a lot of psychological damage to people. And in the mid 80s, I wrote to Bud Hopkins and mentioned these two incidents that I just told you and a handful of others. And I remember I got a letter back from, I guess, his secretary saying that Bud wouldn't be interested in this, even though I had lost time, just like in his book, because they didn't fit his narrative. So my take on this is that Bud Hopkins not only played around with the minds of some of these people, that most famously in the second book, I think there's a woman in Manhattan, I forget her name, that apparently saw UFOs flying over Manhattan, abducting people out of apartment buildings. But Hopkins intentionally weeded out anything that didn't fit to his overall arching narrative. He was intent on creating a mythos that had the Bud Hopkins imprimatur. And I think he did a lot of damage to a lot of not only people psychologically, but to the whole idea of the mythos. He was actively trying to create and put himself in the middle of a cultural myth. What is your take on Hopkins?
I've had no personal contact with him.
And I
I
should say
must
he's
say,
deceased, so people know. So I'm.
yeah, I've had no personal contact with him. I cannot judge his sincerity. I do know that Jerry Clark swears by him, and I swear by Jerry Clark. That Clark clearly saw, who knew him fairly well, saw something greatly to admire in him. Uh, I am not shocked by what you tell me. I think we all weed out that which doesn't conform to our structure, and we do it at the expense of ourselves, our fellow humans, and our truth.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference, though, is Hopkins, for better or worse, in the mid 80s to about 2000, became sort of the poobah of abductionism. And when you are in a position of power like that, with power comes responsibility, to quote Stan Lee, the creator
Yeah.
of Spider-Man. And so that's one of the things. And I'm just wondering, because I'm absolutely certain that Bud Hopkins was not the only person who ever did this, weeding out stuff in UFO lore, in people who, if you just watch some of the cable TV shows about, well, we're going to go hunt a Bigfoot, and we never find Bigfoot, but at the end of each show they'll say, well, this was a successful journey because there was some creature clearly gnawing at some pork that we had in a basket 10 feet off the ground. So it had to be Bigfoot, even though a squirrel might go across the wire or whatnot and get to it. So, what role do you think? Because we talked about contactees, and you said you thought most of them were frauds, and Charlotte and George Adamski, and later on I would include Billy Meyer. I found his stuff to be ridiculous. Malefactors, I guess we would call them, not true actors, but malefactors who deliberately go in and muddy the waters. What can you? Are there some names of people? I mean, we can just no one alive, but some historically that you think did great damage to the study of UFOs.
No, I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so, because I think everyone, including George Adamski,
yeah.
has helped advance the study of UFOs.
In what way?
By creating another aspect of the myth. That if Adamski, and I'll come back to a theme that I just touched on, which is that there seems to be a distinct African American UFO tradition that runs parallel to the white tradition, but is not quite identical with it. That if Adamski, in peopling the solar system with blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryans, is a photographic replication of Elijah Muhammad, who peoples the solar system with blacks, then he is contributing to the myth, whether he did it for money or not. So yeah, I think that Adamski must be understood and taken seriously, even though I don't like him.
You mentioned another fellow that you in the book. I don't know if you say you dislike, but Donald Menzel. Can you talk about him, because he was a figure in the 1950s, and later on, I think he was sort of backwards inserted into this. What was it called? The 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 Majestic 12.
Yeah. Magic 12.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Somebody with a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Menzel was one of the two great UFO debunkers. I used to call them arch debunkers until somebody in my writing group pointed out that when you say arch debunker, you sound like Archie Bunker from the 1970s sitcom All in the Family. So I tried to cure myself of calling him the arch debunker. That in the 1950s and the early 60s, he wrote well, there were two books then, and then he published a third, a really very weak book some years afterward, trying to prove that there were no such things as UFOs, and that the sightings could all be explained as atmospheric phenomena.
Mhm.
He was succeeded in this role by Philip Klaus. Now, to me, the intriguing question about Menzel is, why did he pour so much energy into a subject which, by his accounting, was of no importance? And I would think that and this is one thing I do believe, that the debunker is as emotionally engaged with the UFO as the believer.
Yeah.
Only with a negative sign attached.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned, when in the 1980s, a series of a document was supposedly discovered, which was supposedly a report prepared for President-elect Eisenhower in 1952 about that it went back to the Roswell crash, and that the bodies had been retrieved, and that this was all top secret. And among those who signed the report, allegedly, was Donald Menzel.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's pretty well agreed that this report was a forgery. And I think whoever forged it either had a good sense of humor, or, and this just occurred to me, was zeroing in on something about Menzel that wasn't apparent on the surface. That I know we do know that he did hundreds of drawings of extraterrestrials. So clearly, there was something about the idea of ET that powerfully appealed to him.
Yeah. So let's wrap up then, David. In the remainder of your lifetime, do you expect there to be any kind of breakthrough, even if we're talking socially, sociologically, about UFOs? Do you think that UFOs will, because you mentioned in the book how, on the one hand, millions of people have claimed to see UFOs, yet no one wants to do it in public. And here in now 2020, we have the ability now to take photos and even videos from our cell phones and whatnot. And yet, as far as I know, at least in terms of the public consciousness, there seems to be a lot less interest in this or emphasis on it, because you can all go to these YouTube channels and you can see easily faked ghost photos or easily faked videos of something walking, in the wood, in a wooded area or something. Do you think that our technology has now sort of obviated that myth, and will the UFO mythos morph into something different now?
It may. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the argument that we ought to have with cell phones having photographic capabilities all over the place, that we ought to have more and better UFO photos if they're real. I think it's a totally valid argument, and it's one of the things that persuades me that they do not physically exist. But on the other hand, UFOs have achieved a level of societal respectability in the past 3 or 4 years that would have been undreamed of when I was a kid. The New York Times runs front page stories about hidden Pentagon programs and Navy videos.
Yeah.
The New York Times, this is all the news that fits to print, that's fit to print. The old gray lady, America's newspaper of record. This same New York Times allows a byline to Leslie Kean, the author of a UFO bestseller. What's happened here? And my own view is that this has something to do with the great seismic shift that happened in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah. And I think my own guess, okay, this is a guess, a speculation, that I think that UFOs appeared In my book, I argue this, that UFOs appeared in 1947 as a response to the awareness that the collective death of the human species was a real possibility with nuclear war. They have gained in respectability in response to the awareness that another type of collective death may possibly be awaiting us in the form of global warming. This might explain why I think I see a correlation between the media that have waved the flag for the UFOs in the past few years and those that are hostile to Donald Trump.
Mhm.
Generally, it's the liberal East Coast media that have gone for UFOs. And now with coronavirus, where we get perhaps a foretaste of what I hope doesn't come from global warming. UFOs, well, Belgians are seeing more UFOs than any time in 30 years. They're satellite systems put up by Elon Musk, but the essential point is people are perceiving them as UFOs. And now the Pentagon makes the decision to release its UFO videos, and Senator Harry Reid declares, well, that's a step in the right direction, but we need to go a lot further. So yeah, I think that the UFO myth is going to take on new shapes. The UFO experience will take on new shapes. Neither the myth nor the experience relates to objective machines outside of us, but both, it seems to me, are profoundly authentic and deserving of attention.
Well, David Halpern is the man. DavidHalpern.net is the website, and Intimate Alien is his latest book. And as I said, I'll link to it below from several outlets. And a pleasure speaking with you again, David. Feel free anytime you want to talk about anything new in your field. Just send me an email or whatnot, because terrific talk. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Dan. It was a pleasure.